Today is Thursday, December 5th, 2013. I want to thank everybody for calling in tonight to listen to this discussion on Common Core. I know that I reached out to a lot of legislators and school board members throughout New Hampshire, and so I want to thank them for their service, first of all, and then thank them for taking the time to listen in, and, of course, all the parents and anybody else interested in joining us tonight. I do want to thank Professor Milgram and Stotsky for taking their time to go through this important issue with us and discuss their participation on the Common Core Validation Committee and, of course, their expertise. We are recording this conference call, and I do apologize. I know I sent this out as a webinar. I have not done this before, and so I'm kind of new to it, so I'm figuring it out as I go along, so please be patient with me. It is a conference call, and I do apologize for that confusion. If you would like to listen to this when it is completed, if you have to leave early, or if you would like to forward it on, I had a couple people already say that they could not make it tonight. We are going to post this at our website, www.nhcornerstone.org. I do not know exactly where it's going to be yet. Hoping maybe on the events page. But if you have any trouble accessing this call, certainly email me and I will send you the link. My email address, if you have any questions during this call, I would prefer you to send them to me, and then we'll ask them at the end. It's abanfield@nhcornerstone.org, and then at the end what I'll do is I'll propose the questions to each of our participants tonight. As we go through this, if there are websites that are mentioned, I will certainly also include those at the link at the Cornerstone website, so that way you have access to that information. Let me first begin by introducing our two guests, Professor Stotsky and Professor Milgram, who I have been communicating with for several years now, even prior to Common Core. And so it's an absolute honor to speak with both of them, although I've had the pleasure of participating with Professor Stotsky in some of these panel discussions in the past, but this is really the first time I've been able to talk to Dr. Milgram directly, and it's an absolute honor for me because these are two individuals that I refer to as my experts, and I think once you hear their credentials and their background, you'll understand why. Professor Stotsky is credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K-12 students, as well as the strongest academic standards and licensure tests for prospective teachers, while serving as Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. She is also known nationwide for her in-depth analysis of the problems in Common Core's English Language Arts standards. Professor Stotsky served as the only English language standards expert on the Common Core Validation Committee. Professor Milgram is an emeritus professor of mathematics at Stanford University. He received his BS and MS from the University of Chicago and his PhD from the University of Minnesota. He has given lectures around the world and has been a member of numerous boards and committees, including the National Board of Education Sciences, a body created by the Education Sciences Reform Act of 2002 to advise and consult with the Director of the Institute of Education Sciences on agency policies. Dr. Milgram served as the only content expert on the Common Core Mathematics Validation Committee. Both Professor Milgram and Stotsky refused to sign off on the academic quality of the national standards and made public their explanation and criticism of the final version of Common Core standards. They join us to explain the process they went through while serving on this committee and why they refused to sign off on the Common Core standards. It is a little bit after 7. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions at the end. So what I thought I would do is have Professor Stotsky start by explaining the process that she went through. If she wants to add to her credentials, and believe me, there's many more things that we can certainly look to that she has done in the past, and kind of explain why she refused to sign off on the English standards, and then we will move to Professor Milgram after that. So maybe take about 20 minutes. I'm going to try to just kind of stay out of it so the callers can listen to you guys directly. If something pops into my head, I certainly will add to the discussion, but I'm going to let you both speak about 20 minutes, if that's okay, and then we'll move to the questions. And again, if anybody has any questions as you're listening, just email them to me at abanfield@nhcornerstone.org, and we will certainly try to get those questions answered at the end of this. So welcome to both of you, and Professor Stotsky, if you would begin, that would be great.
Thank you. I'll begin by just describing very briefly what the purposes of the validation committee were. We were, the two of us plus 25 to 27 other people, were on this committee that was put into place during the middle of 2009. And among our various charges, we were to make sure that the standards were comparable to the expectations of other leading nations, were informed by available research or evidence, were appropriate in terms of their level of clarity and specificity. And this was among other things that we also had to look at, but those were the main criteria. Were they rigorous, and were they internationally benchmarked and research-based? This was central. Now, who was on this committee? Let's begin with that. We were put onto a committee that contained, for the most part, people who were associated with the testing industry in this country and elsewhere, or people who had appointments in schools of education or were administrators or teachers in our public schools. As Professor Milgram will explain, he was the only mathematician on this committee. I was the only English language arts standards expert, which sounds rather strange for a committee that is supposed to be validating the standards that are being developed at the same time that we are on this committee. Remember, the standards are being developed between 2009 and 2010, and we're looking at the various drafts and communicating with each other, which we can't talk about because we had to sign a confidentiality agreement saying that we would not ever communicate anything about what we did on the committee. But we were also communicating with the standards writers, and I will say a few words about them, as well as with anyone else outside the process, because that they couldn't forbid us from doing. We could communicate, as I did. I was on the Massachusetts State Board of Education at the time, and all my critiques of the various drafts went not only to the standards writers, who seemed to ignore everything I said because I never heard from any of them, but I also distributed my critical comments to my colleagues on the Massachusetts Board of Education, who also, I must say, ignored anything I wrote and never asked me any questions about what was going on this committee. And with the standards, even though they knew we were being prepared to make the vote as a Board of Education by July 2010, after the standards had been completed. Now, let's go back to what I mentioned earlier. Who were the people writing these standards? And I will just focus on the English language arts writers. They were people whose names are well known now. David Coleman, who is now president of the College Board, Susan Pimentel, and a third person named James Patterson, who was a staff member at ACT, but he seemed to play no particular role, was soon dropped out of the limelight, and we never heard from him again. And in the past 3 years, have really not ever heard from him at all publicly. The other two have been very prominent and are considered the architects of the ELA standards. But as architects, what were their qualifications? Very minimal. Neither of them had had any teaching experience at any level of education, K-12 or even in higher education. Yet they were supposed to be coming up with grade level standards and with a college readiness level. Now, one might say, well, they were going to have help from a cast of thousands back in the behind the scenes, except that there's no documentation of any of that because the whole process was simply totally non-transparent. No one had access to any of the criticisms that were being made by anybody sent in. No one knows whether their remarks were used, how they were used, because the final decisions were always being made, so far as we knew, by these two people, and that was all we could go on. even though there are many states to this day who think that indeed they had groups of teachers and staff members from their departments of education who are all helping the standards writers develop the standards. But when you ask what standards did they actually develop, you don't get any answer. No one can point to any standards that frankly make much sense in English language arts that anyone would want to claim ownership of. We have yet to hear from any state committee claiming ownership of any of the ELA standards. So we have a non-transparent process that continues until these standards are completed. In May of 2010, members of the Validation Committee are asked to sign off. Do we approve of these standards? And I, frankly, had almost no interaction with any of the standards writers. Professor Milgram had a different experience because he did know the mathematicians, and he can talk about that himself. But I had almost no interaction. They never responded to anything I said, and whatever the problems, basic problems in the document there were from the beginning, they remained until the very end. So it was clear that whatever I was doing on the validation committee had no impact, nor was I able to discharge my responsibilities. So I did not sign off, and I explained why in a letter of explanation that I then posted, sent to my colleagues on the State Board of Education. No questions were asked. No one cared, because it was very clear in Massachusetts that the Common Core standards were going to be adopted, even though they were inferior to what the state already had, because the state had been promised $250 million in Race to the Top money if we dumped our own standards and adopted Common Core. That was common knowledge. I'm not making this up. This was well known to just about everybody involved. And indeed, even though there were a few so-called reports that came out, one from Achieve that was funded by the Gates Foundation, another report by the Fordham Institute, also funded by the Gates Foundation, and a third report that was indirectly funded by the Gates Foundation through a pass-through that came through the Hunt Institute in North Carolina to the Massachusetts Business Education Alliance. They did their own crosswalk, and all three reports said that the English language arts standards that have been produced by Common Core are either as good as or better than whatever existed in Massachusetts. So that was the ostensible rationale for dumping our standards. The chair of the Massachusetts board, Marie Banfield, when I asked her why they adopted an inferior set of standards, said to me they had higher expectations. That was the only thing she could say. She never bothered to look at the standards. She couldn't tell you what was in either set of standards, but it didn't make any difference. It was a political commitment, and the whole process was a political process. It was never educational. And this is important today to remember that what kinds of standards are now being imposed and implemented in the classrooms were developed for political reasons, certainly in the English language arts, and went through a political process, and the political process to get rid of them is turning out to be very sticky and very difficult. Now, I don't know if you want me to continue going on with more details about the Validation Committee. I think we should say a few words about the basic or central problems with the English language arts standards themselves.
Right, I agree, because I think that you did a great job of covering the process that you went through. But I think what parents and what school board members really need to know is the flaws. What should they be looking for? What are the basic or central problems with the English language arts standards themselves? Because that was what I focused on. And the first issue, the first problem, is that most of what they call college readiness and grade level standards are content-free skills. There's nothing to guide the development of a coherent curriculum.
because what we are dealing with are skills. Let me give an example of an anchor standard, which was one of the overarching standards, and it's a skill, not a standard, and you'll see why in a minute. This standard is there, plastered throughout, and here it is. Analyze how and why individuals, events, and ideas develop and interact over the course of a text. It's a pretty awful sentence, and no good English teacher would have ever allowed it. Now, the grade level standard that is supposed to clarify this anchor standard is the following. Analyze a complex set of ideas or sequence of events and explain how specific individuals, ideas, or events interact and develop over the course of a text. Not very different. This is the best example I can give you of what is almost close to gibberish in this document. Why is it a free-floating skill? That is because you can apply that particular statement to the Three Little Pigs or to Moby Dick. It can be applied to anything because in its own way it does not give you content, it doesn't give you quality, it doesn't give you level of reading difficulty. You have no idea where you can draw your examples from. All right, that's one major flaw. Another one is related to this common phrase we hear being repeated all the time. Common Core standards are supposedly fewer, clearer, and deeper. Well, when you count them, they may appear to be fewer in number than those in many states, but that is only because very different objectives or activities are bundled incoherently into one standard. For example, here's one, and it's a literature standard for grades 9 and 10. Students are asked to determine a theme or central idea of a text, analyze in detail its development over the course of a text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details, and then provide a summary of the text. This wretched sentence is a jumble of at least 3 different activities. You've got to determine a theme, analyze its development, and summarize a complete text. So it's easy to see why one can claim that Common Core standards are fewer in number. You just take a number of different things and stick them all together, separated by colons or semicolons. But then that doesn't make them easier to read or easy to interpret or to use. And that is, of course, part of the problem that develops different interpretations. And here is where the test developers are going to have a field day. They will interpret it as they wish. So that is a second, as I would call it, basic problem. Here's a third, and I'll go through these a little more quickly because I have written about these elsewhere and have said this many times. Common Core's ELA standards stress writing more than reading at every grade level, which is just the opposite of what a sound curriculum should do in K-12. Everyone knows that good writing follows good reading. Every teacher knows that. And there is actually research that has been done over the years. It's called prose model research, and we know that people who are good readers, who have read lots of good English prose, have internalized the structure of good English sentences and can become better writers when they're given writing practice to do. So we have an imbalance at every grade level, and parents are going to see little children struggling with writing, and they're going to be told, oh, this is going to be good for them. But the problem is they've had very little reading practice to begin with. Then we have a fourth major issue to deal with, and this one has received a lot of notoriety. There are 10 reading standards for information at every grade level from K to 12. There are 9 standards for literature at every grade level from K to 12, which has implied to superintendents and to English teachers that there's to be about a 50-50 division between what is called informational or nonfiction text and literature text. This is a very poor division. At the high school level, it has no relationship to what English teachers have always been trained to teach, which is mainly complex literature. And it opens the floodgate for a lot of stuff now coming into the reading or English class that is poor information or nonfiction, because there's very little of it that is of high quality to begin with. It's literature that has always been the focus of the English class, whereas informational texts have been in your other subjects, which is where they belong. But the English class is to be divided 50-50 all the way through, and this is the problem for the reading or English teacher. Do you want me to stop at some point here, Mayor? I'm not sure how long you want me to continue. I can just say that there's only one more major issue I'd like to mention, that there's a big claim constantly made that Common Core's English Language Arts standards are going to develop critical thinking, produce deeper learning, and encourage collaborative skills. Well, they can't do any of the above, because that isn't how critical thinking gets developed. For the most part, if you asked teachers and observers of what happens in a good curriculum over the years, students learn how to read analytically by English teachers who show them how to read between the lines of complex literary texts. You don't learn to be a critical thinker by reading your science textbook or your math textbook. That's not the basis for developing critical thinking. You learn by good English teachers with good material who teach you how to read between the lines, and you learn what analytical reading is, as opposed to just reading literally and absorbing information. So what I'm saying ultimately is that Common Core is going to produce the opposite of what it claims, but it has already sold so many people on these claims because people are grasping for a silver bullet, something that will improve all of those students who are reading so poorly in our K-12 classes, all of those students who are in remedial classes at the college level. We don't know what the actual way in which Common Core's English standards will solve these problems. We can only guess that what is going to be happening is that if you reduce the academic level of what you offer students, then it will appear that you have solved the demographic gap problem, and indeed students are doing better. But that's only because what they were asked to do has been lowered academically. I'm going to stop there because I think we need to get the math in now.
Okay, I just have one more point I'd like you to make before we move on to the math, and that what states can you point to that had what you would consider superior English language arts standards? So it helps.
Yes, I can say certainly Massachusetts had them, but there were several others. Indiana sold a silk purse for a sow's ear. That's one way of putting it. Much better standards in English than what it got from Common Core. California had much better English standards than what it got. And then there were several states that had in 09, 08 revised their English standards and then a year later dumped them. Georgia was one that had actually much better standards than it had in earlier years. Florida had much better standards in 09, 10 than what it got from Common Core. But they just dumped their better standards because they were told they were getting more rigorous standards. And how were their boards of education to protest when they had no idea how to read a set of standards to begin with?
Okay, thank you. Because one of the things that I noticed when New Hampshire adopted Common Core is that I really didn't see anybody comparing what we had to some of those states. And so that concerned me greatly, that we were just comparing what we had in New Hampshire to the Common Core standards versus what we had in New Hampshire compared to the state of California or Massachusetts that had the best English math standards out there. So I did that because I knew that there were other states that had better quality standards out there. But what I found from people who testified before the Board of Education, and there were only just a handful, it didn't seem like very many people at that time, was that they kept going back to the New Hampshire standards. And one thing I want to make clear on this call is I certainly do not support going back to the New Hampshire standards. They were some of the poorest in the country, and they were developed under Governor Lynch. And my hope at that time was that we were going to do this a serious comparison to states like California or Massachusetts or Indiana and look at the Common Core standards, realize that, you know what, this isn't really what our students and our schools should settle for. If we're going to make this change, and it was certainly needed, we needed to make sure that we were offering kids the best standards in the country. So I appreciate you adding that information, and because I think it's important that people listening in understand that there are superior standards out there that we can certainly be using as a state and in our individual districts. So without I don't want to go too much into that. I want to move on to the math. So I'd like to introduce Professor Milgram. I already kind of went through his credentials. If he would like to add anything more, that would be fine too. And let's listen to his process, what he went through sitting on the validation committee, and why he refused to sign off on those standards. And then we'll kind of move on to the question and answer session. So please proceed. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. So I'm a mathematician. I'm not an educator. What I did until about 14 years ago, when I got deeply involved in these issues, was strictly research in mathematics. And when I got involved, I was one of the 4 people who wrote the California math standards. I was a member of the group that wrote the New Mexico standards, that wrote the Georgia standards, and that wrote the New York standards. And I was an advisor to the groups that wrote the Massachusetts standards, the Minnesota standards, and the Florida standards. So I have, whether I liked it or not, had an enormous amount of experience with developing standards, with evaluating the standards, and with analyzing how these standards worked in classrooms. And so that's my background, and that was the background that I brought to the validation committee. And let me expand a bit on what Sandy Stotsky said about what the validation committee was supposed to do. So the biggest thing that we were supposed to do was to add any standard that is not now included, I'm quoting, in the Common Core state standards, that they feel should be included and provide evidence to support its inclusion. 1, evidence that the standard is essential for college and career success, and 2, evidence that the standard is internationally comparable. Well, that was our original charge, and that charge, as I said, or as other people have pointed out, I was the only mathematician on the validation committee, and as a result, I was the only content expert on that committee in that area. And so it fell to me to closely supervise the initial writing of those standards by the 2 main authors, Bill McCollum and Jason Zimba, and just to supervise, to strongly suggest that they do other things when I could, and at a certain point, which I'll tell you about a bit later, to say, what you've got here isn't sufficient. You've got to add more content at the high school level, and I was able to get some of this accomplished, but it was amazingly hard. Now, let's point out one thing about McCullum and Zimba is that their qualifications were essentially empty. They had never worked with standards before, and they had no experience. They had no knowledge of what actually went on in the foreign countries that far outshine us in terms of their outcomes, and they just had no background. But they were serious. They were people that cared. They tried to do the best job they could from the limited background that they had, and I helped as much as I could. Okay, so let's say that's the situation that we came up with, and the result is a document that is, in most respects, purely a political document. It's a document that was designed to be bought into by a large number of states, and in order to do that, things that were routinely done in the foreign countries had to be dramatically weakened in Common Core. And the extent of the weakening, I guess I can describe it this way. By the end of grade 7, our students who follow the Common Core pacing are at least 2 years behind comparable students, same-age students in the high-achieving countries. And by the time we finish with 8th grade, 3 years behind. And then they don't, as I'll describe later, they don't go beyond that. I mean, basically, they just stop. So in a very real sense, the demands that Common Core places on the students are amazingly minimal. But that's what you would expect, I'm afraid, with a purely political document. And indeed, in reality, the first 5 grades, K through 5 in mathematics, are actually quite good, and I would say better than the country even deserved. But once you get past that, it becomes weak, and after a relatively short time, by the time you get to grades 10 and 11, the best I can describe it is as terrible. But in any case, it is designed to look attractive to education schools and content experts. However, in mathematics, unfortunately, these are mostly incompatible objectives. And I'm not going to explain that. So in any case, when you look at the table of content for Common Core standards in mathematics, that there are 4 basic sets of things going on. There's first a 3-page chapter called Standards for Mathematical Practice. Then there are the standards in grades K through 7. And then there's the standards in grade 8, our third group, just grade 8. And the fourth group is what's in the high schools. Now, I have to say that these 4 sections are completely incompatible mathematically. So let's look at the mathematical practice session first. It's the design of this section, this 3-page section, is to attract people who worked, the same people who introduced the 1989 NCTM standards and the 1992 California standards. It was these standards that initiated the math wars. And the point of these 3 pages was to produce a description of what was claimed that mathematics actually is, and that description would be recognizable by those people and that they would tend to agree with it. The reality is that the description of mathematics is not a description of actual mathematics, the way mathematics is practiced or the way mathematics is used, but This is, as I say, a political document. So we had this first three pages so that these people would buy into it, and then we get to the actual standards themselves. As I indicated, the K through 5, and we could even go K through 7, just accepting the fact that it's 2 years behind at the end of the process. Those standards are pretty good, and I don't really have a lot of negative things to say about them. There are weaknesses there, but there are also many strengths. Let's see. In the strengths, I might as well list some of the strengths. So fractions, basic geometry, place value notation, standard algorithms, and then there are also weaknesses: the ratios, rates, percents, and the preparation for abstraction and algebra. And so we have a kind of balance there, and there are enough strengths that this would if you followed this, you would get students who could effectively shop at a grocery store, figure out the best bargains, and do what I would call consumer math. Grade 8 in California and mostly in Massachusetts, grade 8 is where we put Algebra 1 because it's 1 year in grade 7 in the international expectations. That's where kids learn the first year of algebra. We couldn't do that, so we put it a year later in California and also in Massachusetts. So grade 8 was originally set up in the best of the U.S. standards to be Algebra 1. But the reality was if there would be no political buy-in from the vast majority of the states if grade 8 was Algebra 1. So grade 8 is just a spinning of wheels. There's almost nothing that happens in grade 8. And they come in and they go out knowing about the same amount. And then the fourth and the final sections is the high schools. Now, in the high schools, they only cover 3 subjects: 1 year of geometry and 2 years of algebra. Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. Algebra 1, it's late in the game. It's in ninth grade rather than 8th, but it's mostly complete. Most of the things that one wants to see in an Algebra 1 course, you do see there. The geometry is just frankly strange. The way it's structured is the way there was an experiment, and this is the total research on this thing actually. The way the geometry is described in core standards. Back in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, for a short time, Russia, the USSR, and the satellite nations at that time used a program very much like what is suggested here for geometry. And the outcomes were so bad that within 2 to 3 years, the program was abandoned, and all of the countries involved went back to the more traditional ways of doing geometry. So you've got a highly experimental geometry course with no research that backs it up in the sense of saying it's actually going to be successful, and so that's that piece of it. What remains is the second year of algebra, and the second year of algebra is a weak course that doesn't handle a lot of the basic material that is needed by kids that are going into technical areas. Now, I'll say what the 2 of them are. Logarithms are not mentioned at all, and conic sections are completely absent. and it stops right there. There's nothing else. So that's what things look like in the four areas, the four separate sections of the mathematics core standards. And I'd like to tell you a little bit now why, what all of this meant, and what the writers, in spite of their inexperience, they were both competent mathematicians, what the writers really thought about what was going on here. So it may be a tiny bit of background. There were people on the commission that oversaw the core standards development. We just evaluated it, but the ones who were actually in charge, a key person in that group, a fellow named Mark Tucker, believed that there was no reason to have students learn more than the first year of algebra, because that was all he believed they needed to attend a community college. And so the initial draft of core standards in mathematics stopped with Algebra 1. Now, at that point, I was overseeing things, and I just looked at this and said, no, you can't possibly do this. Now, and, to me, it just seemed completely self-evident. You can't stop with Algebra 1. You've got to have geometry. You've got to have a second year of algebra. And I didn't even think I needed to say that once you have that, you've got to have a year of trigonometry or trigonometry and pre-calculus. And it would be nice if you had calculus. But, I just didn't think that was necessary to say, but I did say the other, and I said it emphatically, and it was incredibly hard to get that material added in. It took discussions with all the leaders. It took discussions, extensive discussions, but in the end, that's what we got: 2 years of algebra, 1 year of geometry. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how Jason Zimba viewed this in 2010. In March of 2010, he gave public testimony in Massachusetts in front of the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, and he testified as follows about what core standards, actual standards were. He said, "We have agreement to the extent that it's a fuzzy definition that the minimally college-ready student is a student who passed Algebra 2. Now, I cannot really give you an idea of how weak a standard this is, but there is data from the U.S. government that does explain, I think, what you're talking about when you're talking about a student whose highest math course in high school was Algebra 2. So the first thing is the data that the U.S. government supplied for this kind of thing, analyzing in a typical class what the probability was of getting a 4-year college degree if you stopped with a given course, was as follows: that in 1992, that was the last class that is available where they actually worked out the data. They'll be working it out for the 2002 class very soon, but it isn't available now. There was a 7% chance that a student who had just had Algebra 1 would ever get a 4-year degree in college. If a student had geometry, and geometry was the highest level course, then there was a 17% chance that they would get a 4-year degree. Now, there was a significant jump if they'd also had Algebra 2. If Algebra 2 was the highest course they had, then they had a 39% chance of getting a four-year college degree. Now, that's the standard that is being applied to as the standard for college readiness in course standards, and that means if you look at what is likely the situation today, it means that translates as a 1 in 3 chance of getting a four-year college degree in any subject, and that's pretty minimal. If you go beyond that, if you go, say, to trigonometry, there's a 60% chance, almost 2 out of 3, who have had trigonometry as their highest course will get a four-year degree. And if you go all the way to calculus in high school, it's on the order of 85% chance of getting a four-year degree. Now, so when you have a situation that we now have with core standards, where there are going to be national tests in a couple years, and these national tests are based strictly on core standards, then what it means is standards control the test. They don't control much else, but they do control the test. That's the idea of them. And so if you look at the core standards, you'll see that no more material than is listed in core standards can be on these tests. But it's actually a little worse than that. There are a number of standards in mathematics that are called plus standards, and those standards are not allowed to be on the test because they weren't designed for all the students in the class. And a part of the conditions for the two test consortia that are producing these tests was that these tests had to be available to everybody. And so the more advanced material, the minimally more advanced material, I should say, is not going to be on these tests, and so the tests are going to be at an even lower level than the material that is present. So I'd like to, let's see, how are we doing here?
Doing pretty good. If you could kind of, I'm actually learning a lot from this call, so thank you. If you could mention the states that had higher, or that you would consider superior to Common Core in mathematics, I think that would be helpful too.
Yeah, well, that was fairly clear cut. I mean, any states that I was involved in, no, it isn't. It isn't quite like that. There were some failures, but the top states and there's pretty much agreement on this. The top states in mathematics were California, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Washington State, and Indiana. And
okay.
These 5 states had standards that were dramatically better than the remaining states.
Okay. All right, because I think, like I said, I want to make it clear that I certainly wouldn't, my personal opinion based on what we were using in New Hampshire, I would not recommend that we go back to that. So anybody listening on the call, my recommendation, I think, and I think I can speak for you too, is that, we would not recommend looking at the New Hampshire standards. We would recommend looking at the old state standards that you found in those states, and that's what we would hope our governor would be working towards, and certainly school districts. And I think that's what we hopefully will be getting through it into some of these school districts as they begin looking at this a little bit closer. I do want to kind of move towards the questions and answers because we do have a long list of questions. So I hope when I go through these, you both can kind of answer them quickly. So I'm hoping we can get through all of them. Let me look at how many I think I have here right now right off the top. Looks like about maybe 15 to 20. I did want to mention a couple things real quick. If you do have any questions and you are listening in, just email them to me at abanfield@nhcornerstone.org, and I will try to add that to the list. We are recording this call, so if you have to leave or if you want to send this on to somebody else, we will hopefully have this up at our website, www.nhcornerstone.org, and you can access this at their website. I did want to mention one thing, Professor Milgram, because I sent this to a friend of mine today, and that is the Baltimore Curriculum Project that you had sent out years ago. This is actually before Common Core, and I'm going to put this on the page along with this conference call. And I really encourage people to go look at this, watch the videos. I watched it again today. I watched them several times, and
Wait, is this thing where, let's see, who was it? It was me. It was the head of Intel.
Yeah, I think Professor Wilson was on it, but you guys talked about why we were not able to compete internationally. And I just found the information, I've saved it all these years because I found that information to be so telling and so good for people to understand what the problems are in math education, where we should be, why we're not competing internationally. And then I think you even went through some of the curriculum, some of the textbooks, and really highlighted the problems with so many of our textbooks that we're using in our classrooms. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm going to put that up on the site once we put up the link to this conference call, because I find it to be, as a parent and as just a researcher, to be one of the best videos I think that's ever been made. And even though it's several years old, to this day I think it's still worth watching. So I do want to mention a couple things before we move into the questions. We are planning on having another conference call, possibly in January. If you live in New England and you know how tough it is to get out in the middle of winter due to snowstorms, these seem to be a great way to connect with people. Even if they can't be on it tonight, we can certainly send it out to them later. But we're going to touch on the privacy issue, the data mining, because that seems to be an extremely important issue to many people, parents especially. And so that is next up. We don't have that scheduled yet, so please stay tuned, and I will certainly get the word out to everyone when we schedule that. So let's kind of move to our questions. And again, we'll try to get to as many as possible. And if you both can kind of, you'll know, I guess, who wants to answer it. I had some really good ones come in. One was, what happened in Massachusetts after adopting Common Core standards? And it's interesting because Pioneer Institute just came out with an article. But Dr. Stotsky, if you can address what has happened in the state of Massachusetts ever since they actually lowered their standards to adopt Common Core.
I can only report basically what I read in the newspapers and hear very briefly when I talk at meetings in different communities around the state. But they are dutifully trying to implement the Common Core standards, and the Department of Education is, of course, trying to give guidelines and help, as it always would do under any circumstances. But it is probably becoming increasingly clearer. This is the underground rumble I hear, but I can't give you evidence for it, that they know they are lowering their standards by whatever they're doing with Common Core, but there isn't anything they can do if their superintendents tell teachers that they are to implement Common Core, and the state is going to be implementing a Common Core test. Now, there was an interesting development that occurred on the State Board of Education this past month at its last meeting. It apparently, based on the recommendation of the commissioner, Mitchell Chester, voted to delay implementation, which was supposed to take place this coming year, to delay implementation of a full Common Core-based test. They're going to try to see, from what I could read in the newspaper, half the state would be taking the old MCAS and another half of the state would be taking the new, and then they would try to make sure they could understand whether the new Common Core-based test was actually going to be stronger than the old MCAS test was. I don't know quite how this is going to play out, and I certainly know nothing about what the content of the tests are, but in any event, the important news was that the board voted to delay implementation for another whole year, as they try to sort out. There are many unhappy superintendents and teachers who feel that they've just been given too many directives. This is true all over the country, and New York is actually having far greater protests all over the state about the many directives and what's happening with the trial or transition tests that they're going through. But we don't know enough. There's not enough information being given. We don't know where the cut scores are. We cannot see what the test items are. All we hear is from upset or angry parents whose kids have spent a lot of time in school on test items that they were very frustrated by. We know almost nothing about the college readiness tests, grade 11, because all of the tests so far that I am aware of that have been given as transition tests are at lower grade levels. I've seen very few examples of test items for grade 11 to even get a sense of what grade 11 is considered to be by the test developers. So it's still a work in progress. We really don't know what's happening, except that parents are getting more and more upset and angry, and kids and teachers themselves are becoming upset and angry. How much of it is related to the testing as opposed to the standards, we really don't know. There's no way to get a good handle. It's just anecdotal. So I can't answer your question. I'm sorry.
Okay, there is an article that came out in the Providence Journal. It's by Jim Sturgis and Charles Chipo. How do you pronounce that? And it's called Mass School Reform Sad Unraveling. I'm going to post that on the website too. I'm not, obviously I can't read that whole article right now, but that might be helpful for people who want to know. I think that the scores, the national scores in Massachusetts are starting to level off, and I think that they address that in that article. So that might answer that question a little bit. The next question is the 15% rule of adding standards. Does that only apply to the state? Now, the state of New Hampshire adopts Common Core standards. Are they only allowed to add 15%? And what about the schools? Like, can the schools use 50% and 50% of something else? Can somebody clarify that?
It was never made very clear. The basic idea was that when states adopted Common Core standards, they were theoretically allowed to add another 15%, so that of all the total of their standards, 85% would be Common Core. It makes sense that if you're going to have a common test based on common standards, you have to make sure that all the states are actually using those standards and implementing them. But if states wanted to add some math standards or other things, Massachusetts added some documents from its older frameworks. For example, it added from the ELA. I can't speak to what it added from math. It added some specific math standards in math. But in ELA, it added some appendices that had been very useful in the state for teachers because they were lists of recommended authors by grade educational level. Those were added. But no one's counting the 15%. The CCSSI folks, and by the way, that project has disbanded, so there isn't even, as far as I know, a center anywhere that one could bring grievances to. But the folks who own by copyright these Common Core standards made it clear to the states that they weren't interested in counting the 15%. However the state did it was okay with them. Most states never added anything. I don't know if New Hampshire actually added anything. You might know. But most states didn't add anything. They didn't want to be bothered.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Didn't want to be bothered.
Okay, and then what are the main reasons for the success?
There's one thing I'd like to add to that is that Sandy didn't make this clear enough that the tests will not cover that 15%, whatever it may be.
Right. Yep.
And so the test is on the existing core standards, and as a result of this, far too many schools will simply focus on the core standards and their teaching. And if the state felt that certain topics were just missing and had to be in there, those topics probably won't be taught by most schools.
Right. Yep. That's, I think, the reality that we're all concerned about.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
There's no incentive to add anything since the state would have to assess it itself.
Unless a school district, decides to use a different test, which I think some of the school districts are actually considering. They're actually looking for a waiver from the Smarter Balanced and looking at possibly using another test. So that might be an option for the school boards and the school administrators and parents to think about. The next question is, what are the main reasons for the success in math in Massachusetts? Just the standards, or was there more that was done that we can learn from?
I guess I'm one of the few people who can address that, and it's an impressionistic judgment because there's no way to prove how many factors were involved in what is considered the Massachusetts education miracle. But given what I did during the 5 years I was there, I would say it's more than standards. You need good standards, first-rate standards, and they can be embedded in teacher training. But there have to be ways of making sure that you're strengthening your teacher corps. If you want better standards, more demanding standards, you have to have teachers who can teach to them. And that was what I was doing with the teacher licensing regulations and with the teacher tests and with the professional development criteria. Wherever I could strengthen academically anything, that was what I did. And I was in a fortunate situation. The stars were aligned. I had a board of education that supported me and a commissioner that supported me. So I was able to coordinate the strengthening across the board of all the academic components. And to me, that is the answer. There is no one silver bullet. You've got to strengthen all across the whole spectrum and hope that your teachers, because that's where the cookie crumbles. What happens in your classroom is where learning is taking place. And you have to have teachers who believe that they're following reasonable, clear, good intellectual objectives and know what they're doing and feel they're being successful or effective in what they're doing. And I guess that's what was happening. And the tests were clearly based on those standards. And they were released every year. Now, that's an important point, actually, Anne-Marie, that I hadn't thought about. Because one of the things in Massachusetts that made the whole process transparent was the fact that the statute, the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act, required release of all test items that were used for the kids' scores every year. So every year, people could look at the test items. Teachers in schools could use them to practice with, but parents or others could examine them so that they knew what kind of test items, the level of difficulty, their quality, what was happening in their kids' classrooms that enabled their kids to do better and better on these tests. So you had a clear relationship between MCAS, the standards, and public acceptance of what was on MCAS. We don't have that with Common Core.
Yep, good points. Thank you. I'd like to know. This is something actually that I thought of because I think that this is something that parents and school board members and everybody listening needs to hear. And Professor Milgram, you can probably speak to this. I know that you've looked at a lot of math textbooks and programs out there, and are there? Unfortunately, in New Hampshire, we're immersed in fuzzy math, which isn't going to make you very happy. Doesn't make me very happy. But can you kind of give a brief list of textbooks you would not recommend, programs you would not recommend, and then what are the really good quality math textbooks out there that you definitely could recommend? And same with the pedagogy, basically how teachers teach math, because that's something that I know that I've learned from being on the email loops with you and the other mathematicians, that, and I've even tutored math myself, that, just on how it's taught and what kind of textbook is used can really make a significant difference. So if you can just touch on that a little bit very briefly, because I think that would help the people listening in.
All right. So what would I not recommend? I guess that's what you asked first.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a series of programs that mostly that were written with funding from the National Science Foundation, which are strikingly horrible. And the chief among them is one, Mathland, which certainly we got rid of years back, but I have an impression that it's starting to make a comeback now that Core Standards allows the fuzzy math that we explicitly excluded back in those days from the new standards that we were developing. Then there's the Turk's investigations in numbers and data, which is horrible. These are programs that have errors all over the place, and basically elementary errors, and they don't care. Another program which is discouragingly bad, but this is one that shouldn't be bad, is Everyday Math. Everyday Math had the potential to be very good indeed, but there are, as usual, various political reasons and political choices that were made, and in the end, those choices, which were made strictly to increase sales, ended up producing a program whose mathematical value and content is minimal. At the middle school level, the Connected Math program is a CMP. That's discouragingly bad. There are a few things in there that are actually very good, but the overall preponderance of the material is highly dubious. Then there are the programs that are coming back into vogue now. College preparatory math, CPM, also NSF funded. Core Plus, also NSF funded. Interactive Math Project, IMP. These are all programs that are fundamentally flawed, and it's a long time ago, so I guess I can say these things now, that at Stanford and at comparable schools, the admissions office looked at the kind of programs that were being taught at these times. This is from 1990 through about 1996 or so. And they would hesitate before they would admit a high school student who had that kind of curriculum, any of those programs.
Well, that's good to know.
But, of course, they would deny that then, and certainly I do not know that there's that kind of concern today.
Huh.
But that was the reality then. And so what kind of programs are better?
Yeah.
Okay, well, they have to be written in English. The programs that are really top flight are programs are the programs, say, that are used in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and so there is one company, and I don't like to give this sort of recommendations here, and so don't take it that way. But there is one company that is reproducing the Russian program in this country. It's a company called Reasoning Mind, and it is run by former citizens of the Soviet Republic who are now living in the U.S. And then there's a very successful program in Massachusetts. I guess it's Russian after school and now school program, and then I guess now there's also Russian schools.
Russian School of Mathematics you're referring to.
Yes, and the kids that go to these schools seem to be dramatically successful. There is also the Japanese, some of the old Japanese programs, the programs previous to about 1998, and there'll be new programs in a year or two that I think will be excellent. But the programs previous to 1998 in Japan, they haven't been translated. They're first rate, and if they were translated, they would be programs I would recommend. The old Singapore program, old being, 5 or 6 or 7 years old, that is available in this country and is written in English. This program is one that I would strongly recommend as well. But with all of these programs, you run into a somewhat surprising issue. The important parts of these programs are in the elementary schools. And do not appear to put great demands on the teacher. But that is subtle. The problems in the program, the problems that kids are expected to do, are problems that all too often our teachers are not capable of solving themselves. And so you run into this problem that the teachers can't teach them. And as Sandy pointed out, the teacher is a critical cog in this process. Without the teachers there and the teachers knowing what they're doing and knowing the content, nothing is actually going to help. The kids will just not learn very much. And here we get to the point where these programs are so much better than what we actually do that our teachers really have difficulty teaching from them.
Right. What would you say about the old Saxon series? Because I know that a lot of people have used that.
That's what we call the ramp-up series, and it is very effective and is very good, but it's not really designed to get kids beyond a certain level of proficiency. And so what you get with Saxon is you'll get kids who know very well what they learned in Saxon, and they really do learn it better than kids. Most other kids in this country learn the material at that level. But it's just the program itself kind of ends before you get to the point where the kids can start to learn the mathematics that is most useful in the STEM areas or in related areas like economics and things like that. So technical, they're not the best for technical areas. Can
you identify like an Algebra 1, a Geometry and Algebra 2 text? Because from what I recall that some of the recommendations were anything by Mary Dolciani, if I'm not mistaken. And then
that hasn't changed, but the Dolciani texts have been adulterated, let's say.
So you'd have to look
be
for
a
an
little
older version.
Careful. If you can get an old Dolciani text, that's a pretty good book.
All right. And then for geometry, was it Jacobs and Jurgensen, I think, is what I had. Is that what you would recommend for geometry?
I don't know. There was the Downs and Moise. There were a number of books, but the one thing that's common to all of these books is they're old. Yeah.
There's an article, I'll post it again. I'm sure you're familiar with Vern Williams, and he was interviewed a short time ago, and he talked about, he's one of the most successful high school math teachers out there.
He's a middle school teacher, actually.
Oh, okay, middle school. And he said that in his district, the parents look for old textbooks, because they are so successful when he uses them in his classroom. Okay, let me get to some of the other questions because I know we had some come in. How many states have withdrawn from the Common Core standards since their initial adoption? Do you guys know that? And how many more have delayed implementation of the Common Core curriculum standards or assessments?
I don't think we really know at this point the actual number. Some states have withdrawn from the testing consortia, but I'm not up to date on actual numbers, and it's not clear what it means if they have withdrawn, because they may have decided to go with something that ACT puts out that is aligned with Common Core. So it's not clear what it means to withdraw from either SBAC, Smarter Balanced, or PARC. A few states have withdrawn from Park. But it's very muddy. This is still, the scene is changing. And the bills that have been passed are not clear as to what they're really going to mean. For example, in Michigan, the resolution that was passed, it's not quite clear what effect it's going to have. Some states are still trying to get legislation through, but it's turning out to be a very sticky process unless a governor is willing to take a strong hand as the pressure for doing something about Common Core mounts. Remember, it's only within the past year that parents and teachers have begun to see the real implementation. So it's a little early to see what's going to happen, but it's been damaged. Common Core itself has been damaged, and what will be done at the local level by states individually, we don't know what it means. Today I read that Oklahoma's governor said that they're going to add to their standards to strengthen them. I don't know what it means.
Okay. One of the frequent comments that we continue to hear from parents who've chosen to homeschool or private school their children is, so what if the public school standards and the College Board's SATs are aligned to Common Core? If my child is not public school, they should do even better on the SAT, shouldn't they?
Oh, well, one might think so, but it wouldn't necessarily be the case because SAT is now preparing to align with Common Core.
Right, and if you can kind of touch on the smarter balance, I'm assuming that you've both kind of looked at the sample questions. I went through the sample questions on the math smarter balance a few days ago, and I found that the focus on explain your answers, that there were a lot of questions about explain your answers, and as a math tutor, I'm certainly not a mathematician. It's even difficult for me to explain how I got to the end of a problem other than just showing how I did it. So that was something that concerned me. And then there were a significant number of word problems. And I think what I've noticed with tutoring kids is that they really have to have that fundamental knowledge of the concepts in order to apply it to any kind of word problem. So are you seeing anything in we also had an article, Professor Stotsky, from a union leader, Manchester Union leader reporter, who mentions the political persuasion in the ELA Smarter Balanced sample test questions that he took. And so if you both can kind of talk about, have you gone through the sample questions? What are your thoughts on them? I think because that's what concerns me about the SATs and, homeschoolers in private school, if they decide to really go in a more academic approach to their curriculum, will they have problems on the SATs and the ACTs?
Part of the problem is that we still don't know. The homeschoolers are not being touched right now. They can use whatever materials by law they want to use and whatever the state law is at this point, which hasn't changed. But when their kids get ready to apply to college, we just don't know what the ground rules will be because there may be changes that come out of the U.S. Department of Ed. There may be state-level changes. It's sort of an open-ended situation right now. We really can't predict. Things look ominous, but there's nothing that we can point to. As far as sample items on the test, for example, the college readiness test in English, that's what I look for. I've looked at the few that are available from Park. There's only 2. So I can't generalize from 2. Those 2 look fine, but that's only 2, and we don't know if they're window dressing. In other words, we haven't seen enough. We don't know what the whole test is. We don't know where they're going to set the cut score. The situation is fluid, and we really can't give anything more definitive except that it's all being done behind the scenes, outside of public purview, outside of public record. There may be people from state departments of education who are involved, but we don't know. There's no report that's coming regularly, definitively. We have no idea. They're sort of developing some of these issues or responding to the protests and the problems that they're seeing on the spur of the moment. So it's hard to know what is actually happening on the ground in any systematic way.
Right. Okay, so Professor Milgram, have you looked at the sample questions, and what are your thoughts on the math?
Yeah, I have, in fact, looked at the sample questions in math, and what can I say? Well, they're frightfully similar to the questions that were on the similar test, the CAFC it was called, that was developed in California for the totally analogous 1992 California standards, which were strictly based on the 1989 NCTM standards. And you look at the SBAC questions, and I don't know, is New Hampshire on SBAC or Park?
Yes, Smarter Balanced.
So you'll be delighted, I'm sure, to know that you are going to see CAFC, the CAFC exam. It's just going to be the same. Well, it didn't take too many years before the parents were up in arms in California.
Okay.
And so my real expectation is, particularly with the states that chose SBAC, that it won't be long before Common Core is gone. Now, you just can't do that. There are enough parents out there who know enough about the mathematics to realize very quickly that their kids are being harmed by what's happening, and they just scream.
Yep. Yeah, just looking at some of the questions, explain your answer. I thought, this is something that, somebody who completed calculus in college, and you've gone obviously way beyond that. I was having difficulty doing. I just was putting down the steps to the answer, and I thought,
In fact, that's an explanation. The steps are an explanation. If each step is, you could justify and say, here's why it's true, but the steps are the justification. In mathematics, we don't specify some philosophical reasons why things are true.
Right.
They're true because they're rules that we set up and that we follow, and when we follow those rules accurately, this is what happens.
Right. And I think that I know that I read an article from Professor Wilson a while back that he was very critical of the SBAC sample questions that he looked at because he said that there was too much of a focus on communication skills, and I sit here and I wonder if that's what he was referring to, and he said not enough emphasis on the communication skills. Yeah.
That's just another way of saying this. That communication has much less to do with mathematics than many people believe.
Right. How would a school district access the better state standards that were discussed tonight? I know that that's one of the questions that we got tonight. I know that I've gone and just brought up the California math standards, and by the way, they do go through calculus, if I'm not mistaken, and I think that's, if you can touch on the fact that the Common Core standards do not, well, I think, you did cover that they do not go beyond Algebra 2 with just the trigonometry. So wouldn't that be how, if parents or school board members wanted to look at those old standards, they're still you could still access them through the internet, correct?
Oh, yeah.
You can.
Yeah, you can.
So, not with every state, though. I've discovered that some states have wiped out they haven't archived their old standards. They've simply wiped them out of existence. This happened in Georgia. Massachusetts keeps them in a folder that's called Archives. So you can actually find all the sets of state standards that have been created in every subject, whether they've been outdated or revised. They're there somewhere. But it depends. Indiana, some people couldn't find the old Indiana standards, but there are ways to find them if people inquire enough with the right people, because they exist in some form in some place, I've discovered. In Georgia, someone was able to go to some old scholastic report that had been written by salesmen, and they had kept on file the old Georgia standards, and that was how we were able to reconstruct what the old Georgia standards were, which were far better than Common Core. but they were no longer officially on the Department of Education's website. So it may be a problem in some places, but I can't give any central location where you can find a repository of all.
I pulled up the California ones the other day, so they're still out there, thank goodness. So if anybody wants to look at of course, I looked at the math standards. We do need to wrap up the call, so I'm going to just read a final question. I guess there's a couple questions in here, so if you can just get through it kind of quickly. What do you think is necessary in a student's education to bring about innovation, creativity, and the ability to spark new business in this country, not to mention competition in the world? Is it limited to an education of geometry, algebra, and algebra 2? And if not, what kind of skills will students under Common Core standards be able to offer this country? And then I had another question about, is there a purposeful attempt to dumb down education with these standards? So we'll end on that, and then I do have a couple of announcements at the end I'd like to make, and then we'll call it an evening.
Okay. Well, I'll take a stab if it's okay.
Good. Thank you.
2 questions, 2 separate answers. So first question, innovation and creativity and so on. Well, educators often believe that you can teach that. But nobody knows how to teach it. And there is no research whatsoever that shows that you can teach it. You have to keep that in mind. What we believe as mathematicians is creativity is a personal issue. It's something you're capable of or not, but typically, in order to be creative in a useful way, you have to know the subject you are creating in as just totally well, so be completely fluent in the subject that you are working in order to create something new. That's the best we can come up with along those lines. Now, as to the purposefully dumbed down, I think I indicated that in my previous comments that it is in mathematics. It definitely is. In fact, the authors McCullum and Zimba, after I got the powers that be in that project to agree that algebra 2 could be covered, Zimba and McCullum put in sort of place markers for the more advanced material that should have been there. And they're actually in the March standards, the March public draft of core standards. And then they're gone. They're just plain gone. In the final version, there isn't one indication of anything more than the material in Algebra 2. And the only way I can interpret that is a conscious decision on the part of people to, as you say, dumb things down.
Wow. Well, on that note, I think we're going to come to the end of the call. I want to thank you both for participating in this. We definitely want to get this information out to as many people in New Hampshire as possible. So that is one of the goals that I had with this call, especially those who could not listen in. Hopefully this has been good information for those who did listen in on the call. If you are interested, there is a Facebook page called Stop Common Core New Hampshire. There is also a new Freedoms Work group that just opened up in New Hampshire for Common Core. Go search that out. And I do want to call attention to New Hampshire Families for Education. They've been doing a great job following this issue too and informing people. So please search their website and go through the information that they've posted. Again, we will try to have the topic of privacy in January. So please stay tuned and let me know if you want to be notified of that. And if you're looking to take this information and do something with it, there's a couple things that you can do, and that is to call your legislators and say, we deserve something better than this, because as you can hear from tonight's call, this really isn't something that we should be working towards in our schools. And in my opinion, I think that that both of these experts have made it clear that there's better. We can do better, and that's, I think, something that we can do in a bipartisan manner and come together as a state and really try to offer the students something better than what we've been dealt. Contact your school board members. Ask them if they listened in on this call. I sent this invitation to countless numbers of your school board members. They should have received it. If not, please send them the link and ask them to listen to it. Manchester and Alton, New Hampshire has already said basically no to Common Core and that they are going to work on developing their own standards. So this can be done at the school level. It takes effort. It takes, your community standing behind that effort and supporting the district. But it can be done, and we can do this as a state if we just put enough pressure on our legislators, on the New Hampshire school board members, and on the governor and the commissioner of education. That we should be all working together for something better. We know that it's out there. We know that it's worked in Massachusetts. There's no reason that we should settle for anything less for our students, for our children in our schools. So again, thank you for participating tonight. I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and we'll be in touch soon. And thank you again to Professor Stotsky and Milgram. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to participate in this.
Thank you for inviting.
All right.
Yes, you're very welcome.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.